Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Stephanie Wells here from MEFA, and we're excited to offer another webinar in the MEFA Institute for School Counselors. Today's topic that we're going to be discussing with our fine panel is communicating to and counseling families with unique circumstances in the financial aid process. So we are recording today's webinar and will be shared with all registrants that register for this webinar, as well as being housed on the MEFA website under the MEFA Institute for the upcoming year. And since this is an hour-long webinar, everybody who is logged in and who watches the webinar, even the recording, will get 1 PDP point. So welcome. All right, so feel free, if you have questions, to type those in the Q&A. We have turned off the chat and everybody is on mute except for our panel. And with that, I am going to introduce myself and then have our panelists all introduce themselves. My name is Stephanie Wells. As I mentioned, I've been at MEFA almost 24 years. The anniversary will be in March. And I'm Director of College Relations here at MEFA. I work with families a lot, doing a lot of presentations, over the phone, counseling, one-on-one appointments, whatever families need. I'm part of the college planning team at MEFA who can help them through the process. And I'm going to turn it over to our fine panelists. Kevin, I'll go with you. We'll go in alphabetical order to introduce themselves, as well as mention any, I know Carla's worked in some other private schools, so she'll mention that, that she'll tap into that experience as well when we're answering questions. So Kevin, you can go first.
Sure. So I'm Kevin DeRusi. I'm the Associate Director of Financial Aid at Salem State University. I've been starting, I believe, my 19th year here at Salem State next month. Prior to Salem State, I was at Buckner Hill Community College doing financial aid for a few years. And prior to that, I was a high school guidance counselor.
I don't think I knew that, Kevin.
I definitely didn't know that.
Great. And thanks, Kevin. And then Carla.
Hi, my name's Carla Mincello. I'm the Director of Financial Aid at Wheaton College, and I have been here for just about a year. It'll be 1 year next week. But I have been in financial aid. 2024 is actually my 30th year in financial aid. So I have worked at many different schools, both public and private, but most of my experience is at private institutions. The longest stint was I worked at Bentley University for 13 years and used the CSS profile there. So
excellent. So Carla's going to be our profile expert today. And last but not least, Amy.
I'm Amy Prayati. I know nothing about the profile. I'm also apparently the newbie on the panel. I've been in financial aid for 18 years. And I did about 15 years of college and university residence halls. Prior to that, that was my start in colleges and universities. I worked in financial aid at UMass Amherst prior to coming to GCC. And the focus of my job here at GCC is really community outreach. I'm actively involved with students and families at all times of year, mainly because of the community college environment and how our students present themselves as ready to go to college, which could be in any month of the year. And I'm looking forward to being a part of today's session.
Thank you. Thank you all for taking the time to do this. We know that FAFSAs are open and it's underway, and in a few weeks you'll start getting that FAFSA information. So we're happy to get you in a little bit of a slower time, the 2-week slow time that you might have. So I think everybody on the line knows who MEFA is. We're a state authority, self-financing, created in 1982 by colleges and universities here in Massachusetts to offer a low-cost loan program. And since then, we've gone on to create savings plans, as well as our biggest program, our guidance and outreach for families, school counselors, and college administrators. Lots of training and resources are available on mefa.org. Now, today we're going to focus on unique circumstances that, so we can help those students that need a little extra support, that might be facing some roadblocks in the system. So we're going to focus really on that today. I will tell you that at the end of the webinar, we do have 3 great webinar recordings that you can sign up to watch, because they were live and we have them on our website, about financial aid, a 101 for school counselors, one for families about creating an FSA ID, And we have another one about Mass State financial aid that our colleague at OSFA, Clantha McCurdy, did for us. So we have additional resources for you if those topics come up, which they might. So we're going to invite you to watch those webinars as well if we get off track. So we're really going to try and focus on the unique financial circumstances. So appeals, how does that process work? Each college is going to talk about their process. How do we identify and help independent students, undocumented students? We have some great mass resources that are coming down the pike, so to speak, that are here and readily available now for students who are undocumented in Massachusetts. So we'll talk about that, as well as non-traditional parent families, students who might be in a legal guardianship, or divorce separated families. And we'll also talk about some of the questions or situations that families have asked to be considered for, some of which schools may consider and some they may not consider. And some it might depend on the institution and the resources they have available. So we'll get into those level of detail. So special circumstances and financial aid appeals, they come about when, a family might get their financial aid offer and it might not, meet their needs, and they might have a situation that isn't incorporated or taken into account, maybe on the FAFSA form, or maybe even in the CSS profile. So they need extra support from colleges to have some extra consideration. So colleges might be able to use what they call professional judgment to take that consideration into account. So our panel today will talk about the scenarios and how they deal with each one. Now, the decision, because it's professional judgment, it is done by an individual college, by an individual financial aid administrator. So the decision is final based on that college's resources and policies. So it might be, when we're talking about appeals, special circumstances, I usually tell families to get their financial aid offers in hand if they're a senior in college, in high school, senior in high school, and see which colleges the student is really leaning towards, that they've been accepted to, and to really focus on those small handful of colleges to talk about their special circumstance. There's no need to try and get an appeal for a college that the student has sort of crossed off their list. So we do tell families to focus on the schools that the student has narrowed it down to, and then reach out to the financial aid office. We're going to talk about that process. Some of the circumstances, and again, we will talk about each one individually, that often come into play are income changes, asset changes. Usually families are going to report these to the school if those numbers have gone down. We don't frequently see, and the panel will talk about it, a family who might have won the lottery and they want to report their higher income. That will be reported on the following year's FAFSA. But there are unreimbursed medical expenses. Maybe mom has a young baby that she just gave birth to that wasn't on the FAFSA initially. So there could be situations like that, changes to the household size, extensive household expenses, like the roof, the roof caved in during the latest blizzard or something unique like that. So we'll talk about those. So first I'm going to turn over to our panel to really talk about the process. We encourage families to work with the financial aid office to understand the timing. It could be a different process and a different form from school to school. So because Carla is first in my little squares here, I'm going to have Carla talk first about Wheaton College and anything else you might want to talk about, maybe from Bentley or other schools, about how the process works, where they can find any forms that you might have, and how they should initiate the process. And then we'll dig deeper into the decisions that you might be making.
Okay. Yeah, here at Wheaton, we have students who will sometimes call us, or their parents will call us, or they'll email us to let us know that, something has changed in their circumstances since 2022, which is the tax year that this year's FAFSA is going to be based on, or something has happened recently, like there's been a change of income or a loss of a job. And then depending on what the special circumstances, we will usually tell them what to send in. We have an appeal form here, which is it's an institutional form, and it's kind of a catch-all. So it has 3 or 4 of the most common appeal reasons on it. and people can check off the box that applies to them, or we have, an other box that they can check off. And usually we ask them to send us that with a letter of explanation. And then again, depending on what type of appeal it is, we might want supporting documents like tax returns, or if someone has lost their job, a recent pay stub or something like that. But usually we will have the family just contact us and let us know what's going on, and then we will follow up with them about what types of documentation we might need. Most of our appeals get done after the initial award is sent out. Sometimes families contact us ahead of time, but it can sometimes be hard for a financial aid office to know what to do with that before they've done the initial award, or we might not even have a FAFSA yet that we can look at, or a CSS profile. So a lot of times we will tell people, wait until you get your award, and then if it's not enough, we can look at the appeal documentation and see if anything would change. Here at Wheaton, we offer very large merit scholarships to most of our applicants, so that affects the way we do things here as well. A lot of times people don't realize that they're going to get a large merit scholarship from us, so we usually tell them wait until after you get your award, and then we can talk about doing the appeal. But that's different from school to school, and depending on what type of an appeal it is. If one reason people might appeal is because they got different awards from different schools. Usually that's the sort of thing that, we're not going to take a look at that until after we've done our own award for you. So.
Right. That's more of a negotiation versus an actual appeal, right?
Right.
All right. Awesome. Amy, do you want to talk about your process at GCC?
Sure. It sounds very, very similar to what Carla was saying. We do ask students to wait to appeal until they have their initial award, considering particularly that the FAFSA, which is the only application we use here at GCC, is the baseline calculation for eligibility. So we want to start with that. The only thing that I might add that's different from Carla is we really rely on our partners at the counseling level in the high schools to let students know that this process exists. We do find a lot of times that students and families, at least in our area and the students that we serve, don't know that a special circumstances appeal is an option. So we often get phone calls and inquiries that are a bit, let's say for a kind word, a bit defensive until they realize there might be something that we can do to advocate for them to do a different calculation based on the documentation. But what we do is very similar. And then the only other kind of consideration here at the community college level is the newly introduced free community college programs have really changed this process for us significantly in terms of the number of appeals that we are seeing, because not only do we have the students that are eligible for free community college, but the money that they are not using is then available for other students. So we've really been able to increase the amount of money we're giving across the board, which has decreased the number of special circumstances appeals that we've seen, at least in this academic year since they've introduced the free community college programs. So those are really the only things that I would add. Everything that Carla said is very similar to what we do.
That's great. And Kevin?
We do things completely different here at Salem State. We actually encourage our students to, as soon as you file your FAFSA, if you feel that you have special circumstances, if you know your income has changed or anything like that, to file your appeal at that point. The reason we do that is because we are very heavily reliant on state funding for our financial aid awards. So if we were to go out with an initial award and then require a student to file an appeal, there are chances that our funds may be depleted by the time the appeal is actually done. So we like to start with an accurate, average, what their actual, I'm going to say EFC, even though we're going to SAI, but we want to start with a clean package. So we do recommend students, if you know that there's been circumstances, file your appeal with us as soon as you file your FAFSA. It's an online form. Students can go to the Salem State website and just type in financial aid appeal. The form will come up. Typically within 48 to 72 hours, once we receive the form, somebody from my office will reach out to the parent and or student to say, these are the documentation that we're going to need for your appeal, and then we take it from there. But other than that, everything else is pretty much the same. But we do rely heavily on state funds, so we do encourage students to appeal early.
That's great. Thank you, Kevin. And I think one that you'll probably see a lot this year is students, families who have more than one child in college at the same time. I estimate that there'll be a lot of appeals about that, since it is included on the FAFSA, but it isn't part of the FAFSA calculation for the upcoming year. So there may be families.
I don't know how many of our colleagues in financial aid heard the feds over the summer at the Q&As for our training on the new FAFSA say that they expected schools to come up with a policy for multiple children in school at the same time, which is different. That is, I think, where it's going to land is with the schools.
Right, because it will pretty much be, institutional
Yeah,
aid
yeah.
that, yeah. So it's going to differ from school to school, but I anticipate a lot of those situations. Okay, so here's the topics that we're gonna, focus on. So changes in income. There could be, a lot of increases in income. Hope, if you win the lottery, great. But most folks aren't going to report the increases until the following year. However, sometimes there could be a one-time gain. There could be, a retirement withdrawal that maybe a family used because somebody lost a job. So they were taking out some of their early retirement money just to get the bills paid. So those are, situations. That's an example of things that could come up that, it might look like they have an increase in income, but really it was because they lost a job. So those are things that colleges can take into account. Decreases in income are probably more likely what colleges are going to hear about for special circumstances. So Kevin, I'll start with you if you want to touch upon what you see most frequently at Salem State and, situations where you can and can't help families, whatever you think is appropriate to share.
I mean, the most prevalent one would be a decrease in income due to, job loss or reduction in hours. For the most part, we look at our main goal in doing an appeal is naturally to reduce the estimated family contribution, and starting in 24-25, the student aid index, the SAI, we see a lot of reduction in workforce. We do have a number of parents and students that, they're still kind of recovering from the pandemic, and they don't have their feet under them yet. Another item we see frequently would be the withdrawals from pensions to cover expenses because of a decrease in income. I mean, it's pretty much, they don't vary too much. It's usually a loss of income, the death of a spouse, a parent. We do have the occasional, trying to think of the word I was going to think of, a change in living situations where, they needed to downsize, or they needed to upsize, or they were there. You brought up the point earlier, the roof. We've actually had a few, we had a fire at the house, and our insurance is only covering so much. That and medical expenses. Although medical expenses are difficult when it comes to an appeal, because the FAFSA does allow for a certain percentage of income to be protected from medical expenses. So for the most part, it's a decrease in income.
Great, thanks, Kevin. And just for those folks who logged in after we got started, if you have any questions, feel free to type those in the Q&A and we will get those answered for you. Carla, do you want to go next?
Sure. I think I've done appeals for pretty much all of these things on this list. Probably the one that's the least common, I would say, is the life insurance distribution and inheritance. Those are, kind of less frequent. What you do with them depends sort of on the circumstances. So when we have one-time income that a family has received that they don't expect to be repeated, sometimes we will collect the tax return for the following year if it's available, to make sure that the income in the next year is lower than the base year. That's usually kind of the easiest way to handle it. Sometimes we collect the prior year tax return and recalculate the information to remove those one-time sources of income. And this is not an appeal that every school does. Again, it depends sort of on the funding level that the school has and what their policies are. But at the private schools that I've worked at, we've always done these. And I even did them when I worked at a public school as well. So one of the things I was going to mention is that one of the things we have to do first is determine if the money is actually reflected in the assets that the family has reported on the financial aid applications. And if it hasn't been, then perhaps it should be. So usually we try to find out from the family, is the money still available? Did they invest it? What happened to that money, basically? And if it is a one-time income that is gone for some reason because they had to use it for something like an emergency expense, then we may not include any of it, either in income or assets. But sometimes, especially with something like a retirement withdrawal, sometimes it's just been moved to an asset. And so we just have to make sure that the assets that the family reported already reflects that. Otherwise, we'll move sometimes those sources from income to assets. And then for decreases in income, usually, again, what we do is we try to find out what the family's current situation is, how long ago the job loss happened. If a job loss just happened, then sometimes we can't do that adjustment right away because the parent or student might get another job right away. It might take a little while till they know if they're going to qualify for unemployment or severance. And a lot of times families will call us up the day after they lose their job and they want us to do the adjustment right then. So one of the things to know, I think, about those types of appeals is that sometimes we have to wait a little while. And some schools have a policy that they won't do it till the person's been unemployed for a certain period of time. Sometimes it just depends on what documentation is available, how quickly we can do those adjustments.
Excellent. Amy, did you have anything to add here?
Only a couple things that I think are just specific to the community college level. We definitely have a policy that a job loss or a reduction in salary has to be 6 months or longer before we would consider the appeal. And I would say the vast majority of our appeals are not only coming from changes in income, decreases in income, but also often coming as a surprise to the student or the family when we calculate their aid and it's much, much less than they thought. And it is specifically because of a one-time distribution that is reflected on the taxes that they just didn't know would be impacting financial aid. And then they, will contact us, get the explanation of why, and then we'll say, well, but that was a one-time thing, that's not relevant anymore, and then we will do an appeal at that point. But I would say the vast majority of our special circumstances really do come from people who do not realize aid would be impacted by one-time things like capital gains. Usually with us, it's inheritance or retirement is an impact piece.
Great.
If I just want to add, for Salem State, we do, if it is a job loss situation, a recent one, we do require at least 6 to 8 weeks time frame from the time of loss of job, and then we would also require proof that you applied for and either were approved or denied to receive unemployment benefits. So there is that lag time in between.
Great. So 3 situations, very clear to check in with the college because everybody might do it just a slightly different and look at things a little bit, the timing particularly. Great. So with the new FAFSA, if anybody has seen the prototype, it's the whole section about the student in answering certain questions to decide are they independent or not is going to be a little bit easier this year. So it does have a much better flow than the previous FAFSA. So it should be a little bit easier for them to get through this part of the FAFSA. But these are the scenarios where a student may be considered independent and therefore will not be required to provide any parental information on the FAFSA. So I'll let you read some of these, but some of them, such as, skipping down towards the end, we do have a webinar specifically about with DCF panelists to talk about foster youth and those kids that they're working with at DCF. So I just want to kind of add that in there, that we even have more training just on that specific information. But the question I get most is legal guardianship. So I might have a student who's in the care of their grandparent, and maybe the parents are out of the picture or passed away, or who knows what the situation is. So the new FAFSA does walk them through that pretty well as whether they're homeless or at risk of being homeless. So the new FAFSA kind of gets into that a bit. But let's talk about those scenarios at each of the schools, and situations that have come up, and how they may need information from you as a school counselor. So let's start with, who wants to go first? Kevin, I see you're not on mute, so I'll go with you first.
Sure. At Salem State currently, we have 86 housing insecure or unaccompanied youth enrolled. 56 of them actually live on our campus year round, and we have 35 DCF students currently on our campus. As far as the state of Massachusetts does not recognize emancipated minors, so that is something that we cannot accommodate because it's not a legal standing in Massachusetts. For unaccompanied youth, housing insecure, or DCF students, myself and my colleague Danielle, there are special populations. We pretty much handhold them from as soon as we know that they're coming to the university through their entire 4 years here. And we make sure that their aid is sufficient enough to cover the bills, that they have funds for break housing, and they have funds for books and supplies. We work very closely with DCF. We have DCF on campus twice a year to meet with their students that are here. But pretty much if a student should call and say, if we're not aware of them, we usually become aware. We have a one-stop center. So they'll call into the one-stop and say, my parents, I don't have any parents to fill it out. And we do have, because as my colleagues in this panel can attest to, financial aid has forms for everything. So we do have a dependency override risk of homelessness form that we have students fill out. Those come directly to me and my colleague Danielle, and we kind of work with those students and figure out what's going on and work out what they need. We connect them with resources here on campus and off campus. So we do have a very solid program for our under 24 independent students.
Great. And Amy, do you want to talk about GCC, some of the situations that you guys might come across where maybe the FAFSA doesn't send them in the direction that they need to go to, and they need a little bit of extra support, maybe even from school counselors, to document that they really should be an independent student?
Yes, thank you. I think more than anything, we need our school counselors just to know that they can contact the school and work with the school on behalf of the student when they're a graduating senior. We are regularly looking for the school to confirm for us that a student is homeless, for example. I wish I had a handle on the numbers like Salem State does, but because we're a commuter school, because of a lot of things in a rural, poor area, our students oftentimes don't consider themselves homeless, even if they're couch surfing, even if they're living with family, that is not their own family, they're living with a friend and their family. They don't consider themselves homeless, so we often don't get good information until there's something else that brings us to our attention. And we are also very we have a pretty simple process for a student to bring it to our attention that they feel like they should be independent of their parents. And, it's a simple meeting with myself or the director of financial aid. And the regulations are pretty clear that all that's required is the documentation of an interview with the student. But what we often do have to tell our students is, you may find we will be able to confirm that you're independent, that you meet our standards, but every school can have a different process and have different standards. And you may find that if you get to UMass before you turn 24, they may not be as easy to convince that you should be independent. It does help when they've done the process here and they don't just do it when they go to the more expensive school. But it's a really different population here because we don't have a great handle on who is actually, we feel like there's probably more students that would qualify as independent provisionally, and then, be able to get some wraparound supports from us once they identify, and we can talk to them. We just don't, this is something we unfortunately have a difficult time getting a handle on because students are often not realizing that they're part of this population. Perhaps the new FAFSA will do a better job. We'll see.
Hopefully. Thank you, Amy. That was great. And Carly, do you have anything to add here? What you might see at Wheaton or any of the other schools you've been at?
Yeah. We don't have as many homeless students as, probably, we had, when I worked at a public school, we had a lot more. But we do have students that don't have parents available to complete the applications, and that's a little bit different. So one of the things I wanted to mention is that we do require documentation, and a lot of other schools do, of when a student is in legal guardianship and if a student is a ward of the court or in foster care. And the reason we require that documentation is because at many of the schools I've worked at, we've just found that students just answer these questions incorrectly sometimes. And we don't want to have to return federal aid for somebody if we find out years later that they weren't really in legal guardianship. So we ask for that information up front. One of the things we find with legal guardianship in particular is that many students are placed in the custody of someone other than their parents, and that's what the paperwork shows. But custody agreements do not meet the federal requirement for legal guardianship. So just something to be aware of as you're working with students, because a lot of times guidance counselors are like, oh yeah, we have the documentation, and then we get it and it's a custody agreement. It's also not uncommon for students from other countries who their parents send them to the United States and put them in the care of a relative and call that legal guardianship, but there is actually no legal arrangement there. So what usually happens is if we get the paperwork and we see that it's custody, then usually we will talk to the student and sometimes their counselor and find out what the situation is. If the student's parents are unavailable, if they no longer have contact with the parents, then we'll usually do a dependency override, which is a little bit of a different way of handling it. We'll also do dependency overrides in cases where the parents are abusive, or it's dangerous for the parent to for the student to contact the parent, or the student just doesn't know where their parents are, which sometimes they're abandoned and they live with other relatives or friends and they don't even know where their parents are. We will not do dependency overrides, and most schools won't, in cases where the parents just don't want to complete the application because they don't want to pay for school, or because they, don't get along with the child, or because they don't want the child to go to college, which unfortunately I have seen some parents don't want their child to go to college, so they will refuse to fill out these forms. So usually in those cases, we try to talk to if the parents are available, we'll try to talk to them and explain to them that by not completing the FAFSA, they're preventing their child from getting any aid. It doesn't mean that they will just get aid from the school to cover everything. So sometimes when we have that conversation with them, we're successful in getting them to complete the forms.
And with the new FAFSA, it's very clear over and over again that message to the parent: by providing your information as contributor does not mean that you're required to provide support for the student for college. Because sometimes parents think, oh, if I'm on the FAFSA, then I'm required to provide money. And that's not the case. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, I think we can probably just skip right ahead to the Mass State Aid situation, because we talked a little bit more in detail because of the new changes in Massachusetts, new resources to help undocumented students. But in general, for federal regulations, undocumented students, they can be admitted and attend college, but they're not eligible for federal financial aid. They may be eligible for state aid depending on the school, on the state that they live in. So here in Massachusetts, on the next slide, we'll talk about that. But we do recommend that undocumented students really be in touch, especially as they're looking at colleges, to see what opportunities are at the school. Maybe some schools have special scholarships for those students, or more opportunities, multicultural centers at the school, they might know of resources for the students. We do have a slide that has a lot of resources for you in a couple slides. But in most circumstances, private scholarships or maybe even in-state tuition might be helpful, particularly at a public college or a community college for them to pay in cash, might be more affordable. So those situations can often be tough. But let's skip right ahead to some of the new resources that are available here in Massachusetts. And I am going to ask Amy and Kevin to touch upon this. And whoever wants to go first can present this slide for us. Kevin, I see you're off mute, so we're going to pick you first.
Remind me to keep myself muted, please.
Amy can fill in for you as well.
I got you. I'm happy to help.
All right, because for clear disclosure, we really don't have a ton of information on this new program or these new programs that the state is rolling forward. We found out yesterday that the state's own MASFA was opened yesterday. Right now, college administrators, we have no way to access that information. We don't know what it looks like. We don't know what the output looks like. We don't really have a ton of information. My best advice would be, keep going to our website or the state's website. I know we're updating our website every time we get new information. What I will kind of talk about.
Clicking, sorry to interrupt. I'm going to click on the site. So there's a hyperlink here that talks about the tuition equity. And I also want to clarify that the announcement yesterday that the form was available, it's really only available for students who are in school now. It's not available for the new 24-25 FAFSA applicants. It's really just for students who are in school, college right now. So I just wanted to throw that clarification out there too.
And I do know that students need to have been enrolled in a Massachusetts high school for 3 years. Students that wish to pursue this would need to sign an affidavit stating that they will apply for citizenship within 120 days from the point that they become eligible to apply for citizenship. And that's pretty much all I know, Amy.
Yeah, and we do have, I'll let Amy pipe in, but we do have I'll have a QR code at the end of the webinar of a recording that we did, I believe it was in December, with Clantha McCurdy at OSFA that gets into a lot of this stuff in a little bit more detail. Again, it was recorded in December, so some of what she might have said has been updated since then, but I think that'll be really helpful. But Amy, do you want to add anything?
I would just highlight, excuse me, that the bullet points on this slide are what have to be met to be able to qualify to do the MASFA, that's the Massachusetts specific FAFSA for this population. And they've just are rolling it out. We're not getting trained in any way until January 23rd, even though they were eligible as of fall of 23. And we'll have to see how it goes. This is a leap of faith. And then, the final thing I would add, of course, and the state school population and people who help students at the state colleges and universities already know this. Tuition is what this gets the student. In-state tuition. Tuition is a small piece of the billed charges. And so it's not that they're going to get into a situation where, even community college is free. So, it's important that our folks, the counselors, are helping us to make sure students and families understand what this is really about, is a way to a path into higher ed for this population.
Great, nicely said, yeah. Great. So I talked a little bit about this already for undocumented students, touching base with the multicultural recruiting coordinator, seeing what type of resources, and just, doing campus visits to see, there are a lot of students who might look like me, who are in the same situation as me, what sort of resources, maybe even scholarships are available. And merit scholarships at most schools really might not be dependent on citizenship status. So they may still be eligible for merit scholarships at colleges. Local community scholarships, depending on where they're living, might have resources for them as well. So you'll all get copies of these slides, but we do have some great resources on MEFA.org. The video that I mentioned about supporting undocumented students, there's a link to it. That is our webinar that we recorded with DCF that has great resource for you to watch and get more information on there, as well as a great blog about to help undocumented students or parents. So, tap into these resources. They're all on the MEFA website, and we can, provide you with those, thankfully. All right, so moving right along, just keeping track of the time here. Let's talk about the non-traditional parent family households. So just a quick brief update. Here in Massachusetts, federally, same-sex parents are both included on the FAFSA and CSS profile if they are officially married. Parents who are not married but are living in the same household, same-sex or multi-sex, doesn't matter which it is, but if they are married, if the second parent, even if it's not their child and they have adopted the student, if they're married, if they're living together but not married, then both parents would be reporting their information on the FAFSA. But when we're getting into divorced and separated parents, especially this upcoming year, knowing, okay, who should be the contributor? Because as you may know, for the upcoming year, whoever fills out the FAFSA is not necessarily the custodial parent anymore, as it has been in the past. It's going to be the parent that provides the most financial support, more financial support, that's going to fill out that FAFSA. So that person is going to be the contributor for the upcoming 24-25 FAFSA. So that's a big change. So we have to sort of train ourselves to go from custodial parent to parent that provides the most financial support. So we'll dig into that a little bit. Now, the non-custodial parent, as many of you know, most likely will usually be required to fill out a non-custodial CSS profile if that school requires it. Unless there's, one of those unique situations that, that non-custodial parent is, a danger to the student or something, then they might be able to get a waiver for that non-custodial form. But they should be in touch with the colleges about that. So I do want to just show you real quick before I open it up to the panel. MEFA created this great resource. We have it live on MEFA.org, but we also have PDFs of these graphics that I'm going to show you real quick, because it's a little bit more confusing this year about who needs an FSA ID. So we have these 3 scenarios, and I'll just let you look at them. I won't go into them in fine detail, so that families can figure out, well, am I going to be on this FAFSA? Am I a contributor? And if I am, do I need an FSA ID? So it walks families through all these scenarios so that they can figure out, okay, who needs an FSA ID? So some of these are pretty standard. Both parents file taxes jointly. Only one of those parents needs an FSA ID. I think that's something that there's a lot of, different information out there about this. But if parents are married and filed jointly, then only one parent really needs an FSA to fill it out. However, if parents are married and filed separately, then both of them will need an FSA ID to fill out their own individual section. So then you have, students who are living in a, divorced or separated parent household. That, as you can see, I'm not going to get into all these in fine detail, but you can see it gets a little bit more complicated. The chart gets a little bit more tricky to explain who needs an FSA ID and who will be the contributor. And then there's, if I'm an independent student, maybe I'm married and I file jointly with my spouse, those situations. So this is on there, as well as I'm just going to click over to the school counselor page real quick, which hopefully you're all familiar with. And we did put these charts in a PDF form in English, Spanish, Portuguese, and Chinese. So you can actually download these forms. So these are just PDF documents that you can house on your website or, have printed out if you need them. So this is a good resource for this upcoming year that hopefully everybody will be able to utilize as we go. So with that said, I know I talked a little bit on this one, but non-traditional parent families, I'll open it up to, I'll go with Carla first. Situations that you come across that maybe students need a little bit more support, and hopefully they're getting the support with these situations, but it is a little bit more confusing this year.
Yeah, one of the things I could talk a little bit about is the non-custodial parent waiver process for the CSS profile, because that is something that we used to see when I worked at a profile school. We used to get quite a few of those. So the College Board does have a waiver request form that students can fill out or their parents can fill out. But you do need to check with all the CSS profile schools the students applying to see if they use the College Board's form or if they have their own form that they want you to fill out to do a waiver. When we used to waive the non-custodial parent profile, we used to do it in situations where there was either abuse, like a restraining order, or there was documented abuse between the non-custodial parent and the custodial parent and maybe the student, or there was abandonment. So the non-custodial parent had taken off, they hadn't seen he or she in many, many years. We had many requests to do it because the non-custodial parent was uncooperative. And at the schools I worked at, we did not often waive it for that reason. So just something to be aware of, because I know that for people applying to CSS profile schools, I know that creates a lot of angst. And each school is going to be different. Some schools probably waive it for everybody who requests it, and then other schools are going to be pretty strict about it. So just something to be aware of and work with each school on that. Another thing to be aware of for the CSS profile is that application is primarily for institutional aid from the college itself. So if there's a non-custodial parent who is not going to fill out that form and the college won't waive it, the student can still qualify for merit-based aid if the school offers it, and for federal and state aid. The CSS profile and the non-custodial CSS profile are just for institutional aid. So you can tell the college, we're not going to be able to get this completed, so please just award us our federal and state aid and any merit aid that we qualify for. And for some families, that will be enough. And then for other families, they're going to have to try to get that non-custodial parent to cooperate. Another thing that I think might happen more for CSS schools this year is that as they start getting FAFSAs in and comparing it to the information they have from the profile on both the custodial and the non-custodial parent, they may ask some questions of the family if it looks like maybe the parent of record on the FAFSA is not the parent that is providing more support, just because since they're going to have information on both parents, unlike FAFSA-only schools, that they might have some questions based on the income and assets and child support reported on those forms as to which parent is really providing more support. So you might want to prepare some of the students you work with who are applying to profile schools that they might get some questions later on. I think that's more likely to happen than at FAFSA schools.
Right. And unwilling is not the same as unable to report.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great. Kevin, do you want to add here?
Anything
to add here, or Amy?
The only thing I would quickly add is if families, I think, stress too much about who's going to do the FAFSA when there is two parents that are in a divorced or separated. That's typically what you see, divorced or separated situation. And what I advise is pick one, keep your story simple and consistent. And there are no resources at colleges, there are no resources at the IRS or at FAFSA to follow up on that. So keep your story simple, make a choice and go with it. And, this should not be something that is a barrier to getting FAFSA filed.
Yeah, and Kevin, do you want to just clarify what the feds have said about who provides the financial support?
I knew you were going to ask me that. I'm not prepared to answer that.
It's who. So I guess, yeah, we can backtrack a little bit just to make sure everybody's on the same page. So the parent, the contributors in a divorce situation should be the parent who provides the most financial support. Correct. Oftentimes that's 50-50. And so the feds have said, okay, well, if it's 50-50, then who has more income assets? But really, they, like Amy said, they're really leaving it up to the family to figure that out. But as Carla said, if they're way off, then that might show up on a profile form. But yeah, I don't know if you have anything else to add about just non-traditional families, Kev.
No, but what I would say is if a family is appealing their financial aid due to a separation or a divorce that was recent, we require some sort of documentation of a legal separation or divorce papers, just so that we can then go in and remove one of the parents' income from their FAFSA. We've actually seen an uptick, which is since the pandemic started, of separated or divorced couples that are actually still living together, or at least in the same building. That, if you're in that sort of situation, or you know the family is in that, contact the financial aid office, because there are specific things that we're going to need to ask for, just to kind of indicate, yes, the family's separated, even though they're still living in the same household.
Right, right. And if they're living in separate households, you know, even if it's not a legal separation, but it's a recent separation, then they can still, you know, list their
Yeah.
marital status as separated.
And typically, we would just ask for a utility bill of the other of the separated parent who's no longer in
Okay.
the house, just to prove that they're at a different address.
Great. Okay, awesome. Thank you. All right, so let's talk about some of the, you know, little random different unique things that pop up. So we've covered some of the more common scenarios, but some of the, you know, changes in assets, would that make a difference? It depends, I guess, on the asset. And knowing that assets are, you know, not the biggest driver of aid, income is, but a lot of times families are really focused on those assets. So does anybody on the panel want to kind of cover changes in assets and some of the scenarios that you guys
I
come
will
across?
quickly say, we never see this. This is not a community college thing.
Gotcha. Thanks, Amy.
And I will say we occasionally, but rarely, see this as a state institution. So, Carla,
Where it would actually impact an aid offer,
where it would
right?
actually
Because it's
impact
federal.
an aid
Yeah.
offer, yeah.
Right.
You know, at the private schools, sometimes it might impact an aid offer, but to be honest with you, this is not an appeal we would do in every circumstance, because when you report assets on the FAFSA and the profile, it's supposed to be as of the day that you do the form. And it's really not supposed to be updated after that. So even if something has happened and the family has had to withdraw those assets, I would say it would have to be a pretty extreme circumstance for us to be willing to reduce those assets, and we would need documentation of that. So if there was like a medical emergency that the money had to be used for, we would want documentation of that, or like a natural disaster or a storm caused necessary home repairs. But we wouldn't just do it like if somebody was like, oh, we withdrew the money to buy a car, we're not going to do anything with that. And I think most
Right.
private schools would probably say the same thing.
Right, exactly. Okay, how about since you're on, Carla, if you want to touch upon any of this, that, you know, changes in household expenses that might come into play.
Yeah, so the first one, private elementary or secondary school tuition, varies quite a bit from school to school. Most of the schools I have worked at, we would not do these types of adjustments unless the private or elementary or secondary school tuition was required because the student had special needs and had to go to a special school. And in that case, we would want documentation of that. However, I know that some private schools do an allowance for every student that goes to a private high school or has siblings who go to elementary or secondary school. So at some schools, it's very common and done across the board. At other schools, it's seen as sort of a discretionary expense, and so therefore, it's a family's choice where they send their kids to school. So we're not going to do an adjustment for that. So I would say that one varies quite a bit. Medical and dental are very, very common. However, the amount of medical or dental expenses that aren't covered by insurance has to be pretty high in order for it to make much of a difference in most cases. And I think a lot of families, like we'll get a lot of people who will send us like a bill for $1,000 and they think that that will cause a large change to their aid, and it typically doesn't. So, because as Kevin mentioned before, there are allowances already in the federal formula for some medical and dental expenses, part of the income protection allowance that's part of the formula. So it really would need to exceed that before we could do much with it. And unless it's, you know, sort of a sizable amount, it's maybe not going to change the financial aid eligibility that much. I have, you know, sometimes we do appeals for high daycare costs. They're not that common, but they do happen. I haven't seen a lot for nursing home expenses, but you know, a lot of schools have a general sort of like grandparent or family allowance they'll do for families that are assisting other family members, sometimes who are part of the household, sometimes who aren't. by helping to pay for things like nursing home, medical expenses, or helping to support an elderly family member. So that does happen sometimes. And then for student loan payments, that is another one where we probably wouldn't, those allowances don't happen very often. Not many appeals at the schools I've worked at would be approved for these types of payments, just because, again, there is a certain element of choice that the family may have had in taking student loan payments. So we probably would only approve an appeal for that if it was a very unusual situation. If there were other special circumstances, like somebody was out of work for a long time and couldn't make their payments, or the payments are just outrageous and have ballooned. But we wouldn't do that in most cases. It would have to be really, the family would have to show that it's an unusual situation, because otherwise, how do you justify not making adjustments for every family out there that has student loans for themselves or other children that have gone to school before?
Right, great, well said. Kevin, do you have anything to add here?
Every now and then, again, it's rare, but we did have this come up last year, excessive funeral expenses. We had a family, they were originally from Nigeria. The grandmother was living here. She passed away. They had to bring the grandmother and the family back to Nigeria. So that was a huge expense, which we did consider, and we worked with the student and the family to adjust their aid and kind of help them along that. But we don't see it all that often.
Right. How about you at GCC, Amy? Anything here that you want to add?
No, we really don't see these even as requests from students. The only exception would be childcare costs, and we're going to handle that in a really different way. Generally, we're going to increase the student's cost of attendance to include childcare, because these are, in our case, it's not families, it is independent students asking for childcare to be considered, and we would offer them loans to actually help pay for it, but we generally don't see any of these.
Right, excellent. All right, so let's start wrapping things up here. Some of these changes could happen mid-year. Maybe a parent gets married or has a baby. Schools would want to know about the additional person in the household size. And it's going to be a little bit unique on the FAFSA form, how this is reported. It's a little bit different this year. But do any of you want to just mention a few, scenarios where you have considered changes in household size?
I would just quickly add, we have considered when a independent student takes their children with their grandchildren into the household and is supporting them. We have made considerations for that. That does happen maybe a couple of times a year. We'll be asked about making considerations for that, and we do try to work with those families. We don't really see too many other things that are changing household size like this.
Great. How about you, Kevin, at Salem State?
With the exception of a divorce or separation, those other instances on the screen, we typically wouldn't have the student go through the full appeal process and provide documentation and fill out the form. It's more of just a conversation, and the conversation kind of goes in the direction of, well, what do you think your financial impact of your grandparents, or in this case, we'd be speaking with the parents, your parents moving in with you. And we would work with it instead of making them jump through the hoops of filling out a full appeal form and providing all the documentation. Those is typically just a face-to-face conversation, and if we have additional aid, we can give it to them. Otherwise, we'll work with their budget so that they can maybe increase a Parent Plus loan or increase the student's loans.
Right. Anything you want to add here, Carla, or is it?
Just that some of those changes depend on the timing of it, whether we would actually be able to do it or not when it happens during the award year. And then most schools have, like either a verification worksheet or a household form that we can usually have the family sort of easily fill out to add the extra family member. And that's if we're going to actually adjust the SAI based on it. If you're just going to give the family some more money because they have some unmet need, then you don't need to do the documentation. But if you're going to actually adjust the FAFSA, then we would probably have them just fill out a quick household form and update that.
Right. Everything needs documentation for audit trails, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
All right. And sometimes you can increase the cost of attendance to increase aid eligibility. So I've heard of some of these being considered at different schools. I'll address the high cost of living because I have seen that before where, when you're filling out the FAFSA, the cost of living here in the Northeast is automatically, part of it, part of the calculation, I guess. So, but there's scenarios where beyond that, families may have a legitimate claim to, I live on, I'll use Martha's Vineyard as an example. Somebody who lives there year round might not be living in an oceanfront mansion. They might, not have a high income, and their cost is much higher than even probably my cost here in Boston because they're on an island and everything is more expensive. So I do remember a family that was able to document how much they spent, the cost of milk compared to on land, even little things like that. And they were able to do it successfully, but it required a lot of work on their part. So usually that's not considered, but Kevin, what costs here would you, if you have an example or two, where you would consider it and maybe make a cost adjustment?
We would do a cost adjustment, which comes up frequently here, especially with our older independent students, just their housing costs, because for our budgeting, we use a median cost. And living in Salem and being in Salem, a one-bedroom apartment in Salem could be $2,000-3,000 a month, and that's not built into our budget. As I said, we use a median cost for the general area for the North Shore. So definitely, higher rent or higher mortgage payments would do a cost adjustment, a budget adjustment. Purchase of a computer, our income class freshmen, we already build that into their budget. But if a student in their sophomore, junior, senior year, they need a new computer, we would adjust their budget for that.
Great. Carla, do you have what sort of things you might seen at Wheaton where you can make a change or?
Yeah, we have kind of a national population here, actually. So sometimes we have to make adjustments for travel expenses. So we have a travel allowance built into our budget, and it is adjusted based on the region of the country that the student is from. But we have had a couple of students petition to show that like their airfare back and forth to the West Coast, for example, is more than what we had estimated for them. So if they can document that, we'll adjust the cost of attendance. It doesn't happen very often. And then sometimes for purchase of a computer or other equipment, if somebody's books cost more than what our standard allowance is and they can document that, those are the most common ones that we would increase. And usually with cost of attendance adjustments at most of the schools I've worked at, it's more to allow the family to borrow more or to sometimes use outside scholarship money to go toward those expenses. It doesn't usually result in a lot of additional institutional grant aid because we just have limited dollars to give. And then I just want to say real quickly on the high cost of living one, because I used to hear this a lot at some of the previous private schools I worked at that had sort of a, like we had a lot of students from the mid-Atlantic, for example, New York, New Jersey. We did not do those typically because it's very hard to sort of document, and it's not necessarily a unique circumstance considering that here in the Northeast we have a high cost of living as well. But the CSS profile calculations usually do take a little bit into account where you're from. So there are allowances built into those institutional formulas for different states, more so than in the federal formula. So again, that's something that's going to vary a lot from school to school, but I don't think too many schools would do that one unless it was a really unusual situation.
Great. Excellent. Thank you. And Amy, did you have anything else to add here, or should we?
No, I mean, we covered it. Our
Okay.
biggest one is computers, and it's easy to do.
Great. And I know, previous webinars that we've done on this topic, credit card debt is usually not taken into consideration unless maybe it covered high unreimbursed medical expenses. Typically, the debt that families have, credit card debt, unless it was to pay for the collapsed roof or something like that, typically these things aren't considered. But I remember last year we did have a panelist who did take into consideration for a funeral, like Kevin had mentioned earlier, where the student lived in India, and the whole family had to go to India for a couple weeks, and that was a massive expense for them. So they did take that into consideration, but saying that most of these aren't taken into consideration, are there any that you would? Let's go with the would consider it, since most of these are probably a no. I know, Kevin, you already answered about the funeral, but if you have anything else in addition to that one, let us know.
We would absolutely not consider any of these.
Okay. How about you, Carla?
The funerals we have done, because it's, it's sort of like as I was saying in a previous meeting we had, it's sort of a non-discretionary expense. If somebody dies unexpected, we would typically do that for immediate families. We wouldn't do it for extended family members typically, but if an immediate family member dies and the funeral is very expensive, that is going to impact a family's ability to pay for school. So we would typically look at that. Credit card debt, I would only do if it was for something like medical expenses. Like if somebody had to go into credit card debt because of something like that. Otherwise, it's not something that you would typically take into consideration. It would only be looked at if it was caused by a different unusual circumstance that caused the family to go into all this debt. Something really bad happened to them.
Right. Okay, excellent. All right. So at MEFA, we do have some great resources to help families with that gap or with that whatever they need to pay the college bill. So we do have the paying the college bills seminars in the spring. But we often, at that point, if there is a unsurmountable gap, then we often do advise families to check in with the financial aid office, focus on the school that they are most interested in attending or the top two. Because it can, a lot of communications back and forth. You really want to focus on that school that is unattainable because of the cost. But there are resources, that some schools might have institutional aid they can help with. We do hear sometimes families that are trying to negotiate a financial aid offer, and depending on the school, because they really want that student, they might throw in a little extra $1,000 or so just as feel-good money, schools have told me in the past. We also have Commonwealth Commitment and Mass Transfer to help with that cost of college. So there are, situations where we can help at MEFA, but we do encourage families to talk to the college about that gap and to really, think about making smart decisions about where the student's going and whether that is even feasible from the get-go, not a year in after the student's fallen in love with the school and then they can't afford it going forward. So we do want to, help families with that. In the colleges, I can probably speak for all three, would help families in those scenarios to the best of their ability. So with that said, we'll just sort of wrap up here. If you have questions, please type them in and we can have those answered. But upcoming webinars based on what we're going through right now, creating an FSA ID. We have that great webinar for families based on all the new criteria. We have the Financial Aid 101 for school counselors, which is our financial aid night, so to speak, for school counselors. Any recorded webinar you can get PDP points for, as well as that webinar I mentioned, Understanding Mass State Aid, that we did with Clantha McCurdy in December. That's an excellent webinar that will help bring you up to speed on what's going on. So if you have a need, if you want PDPs, you can fill out that form on the MEFA Institute page. Please, check out the school counselor page on MEFA.org. We have resources for families on there that you can just plug and play on your website. And, just be in touch with us, which I know most of you will, on social media as well. And with that, I don't think we'll have many questions because we haven't gotten many so far. But if anybody has any questions, please type those in now and we'll get those answered. But with that said, I want to thank our panel for joining us today and encourage you as a school counselor to have your families call us. We've been getting a lot of FAFSA questions. Call us, email us. We're open 9 to 5 Monday through Friday. We're here to help with those unique situations as well. And I want to thank Carla, Amy, Kevin, once again for helping today and being a panelist. I enjoy just listening to all of these situations. It definitely helps me with answering questions with families. And I want to thank you so much for taking the time during the craziest year I've experienced in my career at MEFA related to financial aid. It's a year. We'll just say that, and we'll all get through it together. So,
Thank you,
all right.
Stephanie.
Thank you,
Thanks, guys.
everybody. Have a great day,
Thanks,
and
guys.
give us a
Thanks.
call if you need help. Bye. I'm going to end the webinar now. Thank you.